Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 71. Sadly, After. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the exile of Khusrev and his return to the throne in Konya. How the once and future Roman Sultan had fled to the imperial city, married a high-born Byzantine noblewoman named Razia, and sired a son, the future Sultan of Rum, Khubad the Great. We ended in 1205, when Khusrev was summoned from the isolated fortress in which he was hunkered down with his family and returned to Konya, regaining his throne. But why was Khusrev hunkered down in an isolated fortress in western Anatolia? Why wasn't he still in Constantinople? Well, because the Roman Empire had just suffered through one of the greatest catastrophes in its long history. A catastrophe perhaps matched only to date by the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410. And this great disaster for the Romans would profoundly shape Turkish history, both in the immediate term, as the Sultanate of Rum enters into a new stage of political development, and more importantly, over the long term. Because the Turkification of Anatolia, the rise of the Ottomans, and 1453, that is, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, kind of have their origins here, in the Crusader sack of the Queen of Cities in 1204. Now, to get to the fall of Constantinople to the Latins in 1204, we actually need to back up quite a bit, because, like most of the Crusades, the origins of the Fourth Crusade lie in the Levant. Indeed, they lie with the Third Crusade. So let's start by backing up and looking at where things stand in Outremer and briefly cover the events of the Third Crusade. After that, we will jump right into the crusade that it birthed, the Fourth Crusade, that will end with the fall of the Queen of Cities. When we last covered the Crusader states, they had been dealt a devastating blow by Saladin, who had conquered Jerusalem in 1187 and destroyed the Kingdom of Heaven. This had, of course, sparked the Third Crusade. Now, we really only covered one part of the Third Crusade in any detail, the march of Frederick Barbarossa across Anatolia, ending with his death by drowning in what is now southern Turkey and the virtual dissolution of the German army by autumn 1190. The remnants of the German army eventually made it to Antioch, where they were dealt yet another blow when Frederick of Swabia, the leader of the crusade after the death of the Holy Roman Emperor, died in January 1191. The Germans, thereafter, basically ceased to be major players in the crusade, as only a couple thousand knights were still kicking around in the Levant. Well, after this, the French and English crusaders finally got going. If you will recall from a prior episode, this delay was basically because France and England had previously been at war, and had to come to a diplomatic resolution before they could march east. Furthermore, everyone was kind of waiting for Henry II of England to die, which he finally did in 1189, allowing Richard the Lionheart to become king, and then basically immediately set off for the east. This meant that the French and the English weren't really ready to depart until 1191. The English crusading army numbered about 10,000 strong, while the French army led by King Philip was a little bit larger, probably around 10 to 15,000. This time, instead of reaching the Levant by a march through Europe and then across Anatolia, as had been done in all of the prior Crusades, the English and the French decided on a sea route. There were a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, relations between the Latins and the Greeks, never great, had by now seriously deteriorated. Regardless of what the facts actually were, the Latins by now took it for granted that the Byzantines were slippery traitors and cowards who had just sold out the Germans, as they had sold out every crusading army to date. They were utterly convinced that the emperor in Constantinople was a heretic, a liar, an Eastern despot, and a coward. Thus Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France were just not interested in dealing with Emperor Isaac Angelos. Furthermore, the march across Turkish Anatolia had proven itself to be extremely dangerous. Really, the only time it had worked well was in the First Crusade, by now almost a century in the past. And remember, that kind of only happened because Kılıç Arslan had not taken the crusading threat seriously and had left Anatolia basically undefended. In every crusade since then, the march through Turkish territory had been a disaster, sometimes resulting in the destruction of the crusading army, as in the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted and the Second Crusade, and sometimes resulting in the crusading army only being so weakened and degraded that it just couldn't function as a proper fighting force, as had sort of happened in the Second Crusade and as had just happened to the army of Frederick Barbarossa. The English fleet set sail from England and swung around Iberia, stopping to help the Spanish and the Portuguese retake a port city from the Almohads in Andalusia as practice for fighting Muslims in the east. They then picked up Richard and further crusaders in Marseille and Genoa before making it to Sicily for the winter of 1190. There, they met up with Philip and the French. Once the spring sailing season of 1191 began, Richard the Lionheart was the first to mobilize, and by April was sailing out of Sicily. And in an ominous portent for the future of Byzantium, Richard the Lionheart's first stop was not Outremer, but rather Cyprus. See, Cyprus was currently in the hands of a renegade Byzantine prince, Isaac Ducas Komnenos, a grandson of Emperor Manuel's brother Isaac, who was one of the Komnenoi and a member of the venerable Ducas family. He had never accepted the rise of the Angeloi in the 1180s and had instead decamped to Cyprus where, according to both Choniates and the Crusader sources, he ruled as a sort of violent despot. Now things actually might have gone differently, because Richard actually did not set sail from Sicily with the goal of conquering Cyprus. However, his fleet was hit by a storm on the way to the Levant, and certain ships were thrown onto the rocky coast of the island, including ships holding Richard's fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, and Richard's sister. Isaac Komnenos then, in an extremely bad decision, mistreated the shipwrecked crusaders. Infuriated, the Lionheart then landed his fleet at Limassol, and, within the space of like a week, toppled Isaac Komnenos. Isaac Komnenos, likely already unpopular due to his harsh rule, really had no chance of holding out, and he fled the island. He would then make his way to Konya, where he attempted to get Sultan Suleiman II to back him in an attempt to take over Byzantium. However, Suleiman Shah had no interest in doing this, and Isaac Komnenos would live out the rest of his days in Konya as a guest of the Sultan. But though it was sort of conquered as a side quest, it would turn out that the Crusader conquest of Cyprus would be one of the most important and enduring victories of the Third Crusade. Cyprus really opened up a sea route between Western Europe and the Levant, and provided the Crusaders with a base with which to supply Outremer. With Cyprus now in Crusader hands, Richard and the English army set sail again, finally landing in the Levant near Acre in summer 1191. Soon enough, the English were joined by King Philip and the French, and began marching on Acre, a coastal city in what is now northern Israel that was absolutely critical to controlling the coast of the Levant and in any future march on Jerusalem. Now, Acre was, at this point, the critical front of the war, the nexus of the crusade. The coastal city had fallen to Saladin shortly after the Battle of Hattin. However, it had been under siege since 1189. Basically, what happened was that the king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, had been captured at Hattin, as you will recall. Saladin had famously treated him with all due courtesy and honor after his capture, and had finally released him in 1188, after the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy had then fled to Antioch and Tripoli, the lone, isolated holdouts of Outremer. However, when it was clear that the Third Crusade was on its way, in 1189 Guy gathered up what troops he could, including the German survivors of the march across Anatolia, and marched them down the coast to put Acre to siege. Guy had then managed to maintain the siege for nearly 2 years, until the French and the English finally arrived. Now, while all of this was happening, Saladin was of course not just lounging around doing nothing. He was of course assembling his armies. The Ayyubid forces were drawn from across the vast Ayyubid Sultanate, indeed, with some coming from even further. At its core were of course the elite Mameluke Turkish troops, the slave soldiers from the steppes that we have seen forever on this podcast, and who, soon enough, will come to take over the Sultanate that they were purchased to serve. Shocking, I know. But Saladin's army was more than just Mamelukes. There were Kurds like himself, wild Turkmen tribes, Arab and Bedouin warriors, Berbers from North Africa, and even some Persians from Iran. Realizing that he could not allow Acre to fall, Saladin had poured military resources into defending the city. This had resulted in basically a double siege. Guy and his forces besieging Acre itself, while wrapped around them were the great Muslim armies effectively besieging the besiegers. Meanwhile, even before the arrival of the main French and English armies, smaller groups of crusaders kept arriving to buttress Guy's forces, while Saladin kept concentrating his forces in response. Acre, on the eve of the arrival of Richard the Lionheart and Philip of France, had therefore been locked into a brutal but unstable balance between the Crusaders and the Muslims for about 2 years. But now, the arrival of the French and the English changed the calculus. When the French and the English joined King Guy's armies outside the walls of Acre, the total crusading army stood at about 30,000 to 40,000 strong. That is a massive army. So the ultimate result of the siege of Acre, the inner siege in the double siege, was suddenly not in question anymore. Seeing no way out of this, the Muslim commander of Acre, a guy named al-Mashtub, negotiated terms and surrendered the city in August 1191. According to Ibn al-Athir, when al-Mashtub saw that Saladin could do nothing for them, nor save them from harm, he went out to the Franks and arranged with them to surrender the city, and for the defenders to leave with their property and their lives. In return for that, he offered them 200,000 dinars, 50 prisoners of note, the return of the Holy Cross, and 14,000 dinars for the Marquis, the Lord of Tyre. They agreed to this, swearing an oath on it to him, and also that the period for providing the money and the prisoners should extend to 2 months. Acre was thus back in Christian hands. However, in one of the rare unchivalrous acts of his career, Richard the Lionheart did not honor the terms of the treaty, and, likely unable to control his troops, the Muslim defenders of the city of Acre were slaughtered to a man. The fall of Acre was a serious blow to Saladin's reputation. He had spent years defending the city from the infidel, and now not only was it gone, but he had been forced to hand over treasure and prisoners for his men's lives, which had ended with them being massacred anyway. The slaughter of his men in particular seriously damaged his prestige, and it sort of permanently embittered him towards the Crusaders. However, while the fall of Acre was a disaster for the Muslims, it was far from a war-ending disaster. Saladin's massive armies were still surrounding Acre and its environs, what had been the outer siege of Acre, and Saladin now decided on a defensive strategy. Effectively, he chose a war of attrition. Saladin ordered the fortresses of the immediate interior of the Levant, the land just inland from the sea, to be destroyed. This would leave the Franks without defensible positions if they attempted to march inland towards Jerusalem. He also ordered the fields to be burned along the roads to the Holy City to deny the Crusaders provisions if they attempted to march inland. His army, naturally, was heavy on Turkish warriors, and therefore excelled at light cavalry hit-and-run attacks, which he now unleashed upon the infidel. Saladin basically decided to confine the war to the coast, reasoning that every day the Crusaders fought along the coasts was a day that they were not marching on Jerusalem or Egypt, and therefore a day that they were losing. Richard the Lionheart and King Philip, before he departed back to France in 1191 that is, meanwhile decided that they had to take the coastal road south towards Jaffa, from which they could then turn east and march inland directly to Jerusalem. They therefore moved their armies south, quickly taking Caesarea in what is now northern Israel, and then moving on towards Jaffa. Meanwhile, Saladin consolidated his forces and he began to shadow the Crusader army. On September 7th, 1191, Saladin decided to launch an assault on the Crusader columns at Ar-Suf, which today lies equidistant between Tel Aviv and Netanya on the Israeli coast. At Ar-Suf, Saladin's forces struck at the Crusaders from the flanks, using the classic mounted archer assaults. This hemmed the Crusaders into a narrow column. As the Crusader source, The Journey of King Richard states, "In truth, our people, so few in number, were hemmed in by the multitudes of the Saracens, that they had no means of escape if they tried. Neither did they seem to have valor sufficient to withstand so many foes. Nay, they were shut in, like a flock of sheep in the jaws of wolves, with nothing but the sky above and the enemy all around them." So things seemed to be looking Saladin's way, and he ordered a great charge. However, the Lionheart was able to beat back Saladin's forces and turn the battle with a great counterattack. The charge of the Latins broke the Muslims, and the battle turned into a rout. Indeed, Ibn al-Athir goes so far as to say, had the Franks realized that it was a rout, they would have pursued, the rout would have continued, and the Muslims would have been destroyed. However, Saladin was able to pull his forces together, salvage the remnants of the army, and retreat to Ramla, now in central Israel. From there, despite desperately trying to avoid it, he ultimately had no choice but to order the destruction of the fortifications of Ashkelon, knowing that if the Franks took Ashkelon, the road to Egypt, his home base, would be open. But this would prove to be the high-water mark for the Crusaders. After consolidating control of the coast from Tyre to Jaffa, Richard and Philip began planning a march inland. But disputes were beginning to arise among the Crusaders as to who should actually rule in Jerusalem, with the Lionheart favoring Guy de Lusignan and the French favoring Conrad of Montferrat. Saladin, meanwhile, retreated to Jerusalem itself and ordered the fortifications of the Holy City to be repaired and extended. Twice over the winter of 1191-1192, the Crusaders attempted to march on Jerusalem. But Saladin's despoiling of the land, destruction of the fortifications, and the heavy screen of guerrilla-style troops he had set between Jerusalem and the sea had the desired effect. Combined with the cold and rainy weather, the Crusaders were prevented from besieging Jerusalem. On both of their attempts, the Crusader Council of War voted to give up the advance and not besiege Jerusalem, over the Lionheart's objections. Both times, the Crusaders were forced to retire back to the coast, their numbers depleted and their morale weakening. By spring, the Crusader position had seriously deteriorated. Recriminations over the winter failures fed into the succession dispute, especially when Conrad of Montferrat was assassinated by the Nizari Order of Assassins just days after being declared king. Saladin, you see, had allied with the Ismaili Nizaris in the face of the Crusader invasion. Richard the Lionheart was now convinced that even if Jerusalem could be taken, it could never be held. He therefore began to pull back to the north, to at least consolidate Crusader control around Acre. Saladin, for his part, decided that this was the perfect opportunity to strike, and prepared for a great assault on the city of Jaffa, hoping, through this, to drive the Crusaders off the maritime endpoint of the road that led to Jerusalem. Therefore, on July 31st, 1192, Saladin personally led a great assault on Jaffa, today basically a part of Tel Aviv. Led by a vanguard of seasoned Turkish Mamluk forces, Saladin's army was able to take the gates and seize almost all of the city. The Crusaders were confined to the citadel as Saladin demanded their surrender. No doubt, everyone remembered what had happened to the Muslim defenders of Acre the prior year. However, upon hearing of the assault as he marched north, the Lionheart decided to turn around and relieve Jaffa. In a brilliant and daring piece of generalship, Richard launched an amphibious assault on Jaffa, driving Saladin and his forces out of the city and securing the city for the Crusaders. Saladin pulled back, but instead of completely withdrawing, he rallied his forces outside of Jaffa and on August 4th launched a brutal counterattack. Wave after wave of mounted Turkish, Arab, Berber, Bedouin, Persian, and Kurdish cavalry hurled themselves at the Crusaders, hoping to break them or to draw them off into a feigned retreat. But the Crusaders remained disciplined and organized. In truly brutal fighting in the center, the knights and infantry spearmen managed to see down a final charge by the Mamelukes before finally Saladin called a halt and withdrew. By now, both sides were completely exhausted. It was clear to everyone that there was no way that the Crusaders were ever going to take Jerusalem. But it was also clear that Saladin did not have the ability to force them from the coastal strip that they had reconquered, stretching from Tyre down to Jaffa. And thus, on September 1st, 1192, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin met outside of Jaffa and hammered out the terms of the treaty that would end the Third Crusade. The Treaty of Jaffa confirmed Saladin's control over Jerusalem, permanently killing the crusading dream of redeeming the Holy City. Crusader control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa was confirmed, and the territory was reorganized into a new Kingdom of Jerusalem, albeit a Kingdom of Jerusalem that did not contain Jerusalem. Cyprus was turned over to the Order of the Knights Templar. The two sides agreed to a truce for 3 years, and Saladin agreed to allow Christian pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem and to protect the Christian holy sites, including, in an act of magnanimity, allowing those crusaders who had just fought against him to go on pilgrimage to the Holy City before returning home. Saladin and Richard the Lionheart famously parted on good terms, full of mutual admiration and deep respect. Richard would depart for Europe in October, though he was, of course, famously waylaid on his return journey. The Third Crusade was over. The end of the Third Crusade, however, bore within it the seeds of the Fourth Crusade. See, no one was really happy in the aftermath of the Third Crusade. In the West, the Great Holy War to redeem the Holy City after the shocking defeat inflicted by Saladin was of course seen as a failure. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. And in the Muslim world, meanwhile, the defeat at Acre had been a humiliation, and the Crusaders had managed to carve out a new kingdom on the coast of the Middle Sea. Furthermore, the great Saladin would die on March 4th, 1193, less than a year after making peace with Richard the Lionheart. This led to war among his successors, though Saladin's brother al-Adil would succeed in basically reunifying the Ayyubid Sultanate before the 3-year truce with the Crusaders ended. And crucially for our story, the Crusader-Byzantine relationship, never great, now lay in ruins. First of all, the Romans were absolutely livid that Richard the Lionheart had wrested Cyprus from them. Cyprus had been a part of the Greek world since the Bronze Age, and its seizure by the Latin barbarians was seen as an intolerable insult. Isaac Angelos had even had Richard the Lionheart arrested in Corfu during his return to the west for this affront. On the other side, despite the reality of the situation, the Latins were convinced that the emperor had betrayed Barbarossa to the Turks. The news that Isaac had tried to stop the Holy Roman Emperor from marching on Constantinople had spread from the Germans among the other crusaders in Outremer. There had also been a pogrom in Constantinople in 1182, in which tens of thousands of Italians were massacred in the streets of Constantinople, with the survivors being sold into slavery to the Turks. All of this fused together with the religious and cultural distance between the Romans and the Westerners, and the memories of older grievances. The way Manuel Comnenos had conspired with Massoud to destroy the Second Crusade. The so-called treason of Alexios Komnenos. The war on Antioch by John Komnenos. Manuel's humiliation of the Prince of Antioch, and then his betrayal in selling Outremer out to Nureddin Zengi. And the Crusaders darkly muttered that naturally the perfidious Greeks had again been in league with the treasonous Turks, who had likewise broken their word and attacked them. Whatever little love remaining between the Greeks and the Latins was now completely lost. And so it was that after the unsatisfying conclusion of the Third Crusade, many in the courts of Western Europe began talking about a do-over. And some, darkly, began muttering that maybe the Muslims were not necessarily the right Easterners to be attacking. These whispered desires, the inchoate feelings of bitterness, really came together following the election of Pope Innocent III to the papacy in 1198. Innocent was obsessed with avenging the defeats in the East, and thus in August 1198, just 7 months into his papacy, Innocent issued the papal encyclical Post Miserabile, Latin for sadly after. Post Miserabile was addressed to bishops across Europe and called for a new crusade to the Holy Land. Included was the standard remission for sins, along with a new feature, indulgences, for those who would finance the crusade, because, in an ill omen, even before its beginning, the Fourth Crusade was short on cash. And foreshadowing alert, this crusade will end sadly after all. However, Post Miserabile was not immediately successful. First of all, France and England returned to war basically immediately after wrapping up the Third Crusade, and none of the other kings of Europe were all that keen on helping either. Eventually, by 1201, Pope Innocent had gotten enough barons and counts and so on to start pulling a crusade together. The most prominent leaders were Boniface, the Marquis of Montferrat and the brother of the assassinated Conrad, Theobald, the Count of Champagne, and Baldwin, Count of Flanders. And you will notice a conspicuous lack of emperors and kings on that list. Therefore, unlike the Third Crusade, which was funded with Saladin tithes and the deep pockets of the kings of England and France and the Holy Roman Empire, the Fourth Crusade was going to be run on a shoestring budget from the get-go. An ill omen for an ill-fated crusade. Arguably, the most widely despised crusade of all time, though in some ways among the most successful, albeit towards ends different from those that launched it. Now, earlier crusades had, of course, been focused on the Holy Land directly. However, this time, the Crusader leadership decided instead that the real way to win back Jerusalem was to take Egypt. Without the wealth of the land of the Nile, there was just no way that the Ayyubids would continue to control the Levant. But this created two problems. First, you kind of need to hide the destination from the rank and file. They're signing up to redeem Jerusalem, not attack Egypt. Secondly, you're going to need a fleet, and a big one at that. There was no way to attack Egypt other than by sea, ideally by using the new base in Cyprus. Thus, Pope Innocent and the Crusader leadership began reaching out to the only people who could pull together such a fleet, the two most important Italian maritime trading republics, Genoa and Venice. Now, both Genoa and Venice are going to eventually become incredibly important to our story when we get to the Ottomans. But for now, it's important to know that they were in essence city-states that emerged out of the collapse of Roman rule in Italy, and were basically oligarchies run by wealthy merchants. Massive oversimplification, of course. We will do a deeper dive in a later episode. Both of these republics lived on the Eastern trade, transporting the goods of Asia to Europe across the Mediterranean. They therefore had the fleets to transport soldiers in the opposite direction. and both cities were, naturally, fierce rivals of each other. Pope Innocent and the Crusaders first went to Genoa, and the Genoese kind of told them, no, we're not really interested. Therefore, in 1201, they reached out to the Republic of Venice, currently ruled by the ancient blind doge, Enrique Dandolo. Now, Dandolo is a fascinating and today often reviled character. Born in 1107, he was by now like 94 years old. He had started going blind in the 1170s as a young man of merely 70-something, before finally being elected doge in 1192. Now, like I said, I'm going to do a deeper dive into Venice and its constitution at a later date, but for now, it is important to understand the relationship between Venice and Constantinople. Venice had originally been founded in the final years of the Western Roman Empire. See, when the Huns destroyed the great city of Aquileia in northern Italy, and then rampaged around the area along with Lombards, Goths, and various assorted Germanic barbarians, many Roman citizens fled the destruction to the coastal swamps and lagoons for refuge. These areas were difficult to traverse for barbarian armies, particularly mounted steppe riders like the Huns. A refugee camp therefore arose in a shallow lagoon, protected by a sandbar lido at the head of the Adriatic. This refugee camp, over time, evolved into a town with canals instead of roads, where the population eked out a living fishing and making salt, and eventually began trading with their neighbors. Slowly, this little maritime town became wealthier through trade and shipbuilding, and it grew, in time becoming a city, shimmering on the waters of the lagoon. Out of the ashes of the Roman collapse in the west, the floating city of Venice had been born. And Venice, sitting at the very head of the Adriatic, where Eastern and Western empires had traditionally met, was far more orientated towards the remaining capital of the Roman Empire, to Constantinople. Unlike the other polities in the West, mainly founded by the Germanic invaders, the Venetians were self-consciously Roman refugees, and therefore professed loyalty to the emperor who remained in the east. Furthermore, traveling down the Adriatic, the Venetian merchants did good business with the empire. When Justinian reconquered Italy, the Venetians were loyal to the empire and dutifully served the Italian exarchate that Constantinople had established. After the birth of Islam and the Arab conquests, that exarchate fell, of course, but the Venetians remained deeply tied to Constantinople. It was really only in religious matters, where they followed Rome, that they began to diverge from their eastern brethren. The Venetians were granted special trading privileges and soon came to specialize in the eastern trade with the empire, and, in time, the Muslim world as well. Most of the Venetian merchant families and leaders had spent long years in the east, including Enrique Dandolo, who, according to Nicetas Choniates, had actually been blinded on a visit to Byzantium on the orders of Emperor Manuel Comnenos. So now, in the year 1200, Enrique Dandolo was presented with this request to aid this Fourth Crusade by outfitting it with a fleet so it could sail to Egypt. And Dandolo, incredibly cynically I believe, basically saw a massive opportunity in this for Venice. Dandolo basically said, okay, I will do this, however we, the Venetians, are going to keep one half of the conquests in the east for ourselves. Dandolo was already envisioning a sprawling maritime empire of trade posts, what would later be born as the Stato da Mar, the Venetian state of the sea. Furthermore, he said, you need to pay us for the fleet. We don't have the requisite number of ships to transport like 35,000 soldiers. We're going to need to build them from scratch, and that is expensive. The Crusaders agreed, kind of hoping that they'd find the cash somewhere over the winter of 1201-1202, or that the Doge would sort of let it slide if they didn't come up with all the money. But of course, they didn't, and he didn't. When the time came to sail, Dandolo, good to his word, delivered the full complement of ships, while the Crusaders shuffled their feet and scrounged around in their pockets for whatever money they could find, ultimately coming up about 50% short. Therefore, Dandolo demanded that as partial repayment, the Crusaders pay for the ships by attacking a vassal city that had gone into rebellion against Venice. Zara, now known as Zadar, was a city on the Dalmatian coast of what is today Croatia. Zara had long been a vassal of Venice, but had basically become independent under the protection of the kings of Hungary and Croatia. So for purely geopolitical and economic strategic reasons, Dandolo directed the Fourth Crusade against its walls in November 1202. Naturally, the city was sacked and a massacre predictably followed. Thus, the first combat of the Fourth Crusade was an assault on fellow Christians. Obviously, not popular among the rank and file, especially after Pope Innocent excommunicated all of them for this and basically washed his hands of the whole venture. And foreshadowing alert, this will not be the last time Christian blood is spilled by the Fourth Crusaders. From Zara, the excommunicated Fourth Crusade seems to have been planning to depart for Cyprus and then on to Egypt, though still the Venetians were demanding money. But while wintering in Zara over the winter of 1202-1203, a certain Byzantine prince showed up with an interesting proposal. Alexios IV Angelos, the son of the deposed and blinded Isaac II Angelos, and thus nephew of the current emperor Alexios III Angelos, made his way to Zara with an offer too good to refuse. Alexios the Younger, as I will call him to avoid confusion, basically told the Crusaders, "Look, my uncle is extremely unpopular, and the wealth of the Queen of Cities is, as you know, endless. So what if you sail over to Constantinople with me? The people of the city will rise up against my hated uncle and make me the emperor. Then I can use the treasury of the city to make the Venetians whole and pay for these ships, send Byzantine soldiers on the crusade, and, for good measure, I'll bring the Eastern Church back into communion with Rome." Alexios promised the Crusaders to pay the Venetians for the entire fleet at a markup, give the Crusaders an additional 200,000 silver marks, which was just a colossal sum of money, and provide 10,000 troops for the crusade. And needless to say, these were not things the Byzantine state could actually afford right now. Naturally, the Crusaders jumped at this. The wealth of Constantinople was, of course, proverbial. Furthermore, by offering to unite the churches, Alexios was in a sense making the war holy again, albeit by making it an intra-Christian holy war. And for many of the men, currently terrified for their souls after their excommunication, this was really, really important, as bringing the churches into communion would likely mean papal forgiveness and an end to the excommunication that they were all currently laboring under. Finally, we need to remember just how bad the relationship between the Latins and the Greeks was by this time. We have already discussed at length the litany of causes, but in particular, the Venetians by now had a deep grudge against Byzantium. Firstly, their traditional rights to trade in the empire were being impinged upon by the emperor granting similar rights to other Italians. Then, the massacre of the Latins in Constantinople had disproportionately affected Venetians, as most Italians in the city were Venetian. Every single Venetian there at Zara was related to, or at least knew someone, who was killed or sold into slavery to the Turks during the pogrom. And Enrico Dandolo himself may very well have earlier been blinded at the Roman emperor's orders. Finally, the rich trade routes to the east were just too good to pass up. There was a reason Dandolo was so enthusiastic about the crusade in the first place, and it was not Holy Jerusalem. Having a vassal on the throne in Constantinople, well, that was a dream come true. And thus, fatefully, in spring 1203, the Fourth Crusade set forth from Zara to Constantinople, finally arriving on July 23, 1203. The great nightmare of the Roman emperors since the crusading era began almost a century ago, that the Western barbarians would one day assault the Queen of Cities, had finally and horribly come to pass. As the Crusaders began preparing for a siege of the invincible city, Alexios the Younger was paraded around the walls, but to the seeming surprise of the Crusaders, no one inside really cared. There was no great clamor among the people to elevate the son of the deposed Isaac. And so the siege of July 1203 set in. The Crusaders, initially camped on the Asian side, ferried their troops over to the European side, and the Byzantines manned the walls and drew the great chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn tight, closing the harbor of Constantinople. But on July 6th, the great chain protecting the Golden Horn was broken by the Venetians, allowing the superior Venetian navy to seize the Golden Horn. Meanwhile, in Galata, the Crusaders put the Galata Tower to siege. Finally, on July 17th, the Crusaders attempted to launch simultaneous attacks on the massive Theodosian land walls and the smaller sea walls at the same time. The Varangian Guard was easily able to hold the land walls, but the Venetians were able to take a section of the sea walls. These assaults caused a fire to break out in the sea district, which spread throughout the city, incinerating thousands of buildings. Facing this great assault, Emperor Alexios III Angelos decided that he had to fight, and so he personally led 17 divisions of men out of the Theodosian walls to assault the Crusaders on the land. Honestly, a pretty horrible decision. Once outside the walls, the emperor panicked, and the army fled back into the city without even confronting the Crusaders. This broke the confidence of the army in the emperor, and it broke the emperor's spirit. That night, the disgraced emperor of the Romans fled the city towards Thrace. In the words of Niketas Choniates, Alexios entered the palace and made ready his escape. It was as though he had labored hard to make a miserable corpse of the city, to bring her to utter ruin in defiance of her destiny, and he hastened along her destruction. With Alexios III gone, the Byzantine leadership consolidated around the blind former emperor, Isaac II Angelos. Seeking to end the siege, Isaac wrote to the Latins and basically said, "The former emperor is gone, I am emperor again, and I am sure that we can come to some sort of deal." The Crusader leaders then entered the city to treat with the emperor, but to the dismay of the Romans, they insisted that they were due the extravagant promises made by Alexios the Younger, namely, The massive payment to the Crusade, a Byzantine contingent to go attack Egypt, and bringing the Church of Constantinople into communion with the Church of Rome. Isaac and the Byzantine nobility were stunned, and they tried to explain that they just didn't have the money that Alexios had promised, and that if they tried to force the church to submit to the Pope, then they would all likely be lynched by the people of the city. However, eventually a deal was reached, a deal that, I think, really shows what the Crusaders were after. The joining of the churches was shelved for now. Isaac would be recognized as emperor, provided that his son Alexios the Younger be made co-emperor. And the Byzantine state would pay the massive sum that Alexios had promised. Thus, on August 1st, 1203, the extremely short and even more extremely disastrous reign of Alexios IV Angelos began. See, once he was in power, Alexios the Younger tried to find the money to fulfill his insane promises, but the money just wasn't there. The emperor ordered the wealth of the churches seized and holy relics melted down, to the fury of the population. He tried imposing confiscatory taxes to raise the necessary sums, but the reality was that the city just did not contain the requisite wealth, and his efforts to squeeze it out of his people naturally made him hated, especially because all of this was in service of the Western barbarians, currently holding the great city hostage. This led to riots, to fires, and to escalating unrest as a political crisis consumed Constantinople. Niketas Choniates bitterly says that this was the turning point of Roman history, the moment that the great empire was lost, writing that through Alexios' actions, I think the Roman state was totally subverted and disappeared. With the common people and the nobility equally utterly incensed, a conspiracy naturally formed to get rid of the young emperor. This conspiracy coalesced around a man named Alexios Doukas, a member of the ancient Doukas family, generally called Mortsouflos, meaning unibrow or big eyebrows, because of his large overhanging eyebrows. In the winter of 1203-1204, Mortsouflos began leading small guerrilla-style expeditions out to attack the Latins, increasing his standing among the Byzantines as a man who was willing to stand up to the Western barbarians. He was therefore a natural leader of the conspiracy. Mortsouflos thus consolidated support and, on February 28, 1204, decked himself out in the imperial purple and declared himself to be the Emperor of the Romans. He was hailed by many across the city. Alexios the Younger tried to resist, tried to even come to some sort of deal with Mortsouflos, but that was just not going to happen. Alexios was seized and thrown in prison, and, as Choniates relates, Doukas cut the thread of his life by having him strangled, squeezing out his soul, so to speak, through the straight and narrow way, and sprang the trap leading to hell. He had reigned 6 months and 8 days. His blind father and co-emperor, Isaac II Angelos, reportedly died of shock upon hearing the news. Mortsouflos now reigned as the sole emperor of the Romans in Constantinople, but the empire was facing an existential problem, namely the army of greedy Latins outside its walls, demanding payment and ominously touring around the Queen of Cities, with clearly some of them thinking, hey, this seems like too good of a place to be ruled by heretical Greek traitors. When the Crusaders and the Venetians heard of the news of the overthrow of their patron, Alexios the Younger, they were furious. They had been depending on the treasure Alexios had been shoveling out of the doors of the palace and into their coffers. And the Venetians, clearly, were in this to have a pliant vassal on the imperial throne. This was how they were planning to really take over the trade routes in the east. So the overthrow of Alexios and the elevation of Mourtzouphlos to the purple basically sparked a war immediately. Mourtzouphlos, of course, ordered the great walls of Constantinople repaired and expanded, and he even led sorties out of the walls to attack small Latin detachments. But all the while, the Latins were preparing to put the city to siege. By April 1204, the Crusaders had assembled their siege works and scaling ladders and gotten their troops in order, and on April 9th began the assault. However, the truly massive Theodosian land walls stood firm, and the Crusader attempts to scale them were beaten back with heavy casualties. Indeed, the great Theodosian walls would never be breached until the days of the Ottomans and their massive cannons. With the assault on the Theodosian land walls having failed, the leadership of the Crusade, Enrique Dandolo and Boniface of Montferrat, decided to focus on the less imposing sea walls that ringed the peninsula of Constantinople. The Venetians cleverly turned their ships into mobile maritime siege works. Lashing the masts together, they created essentially boarding platforms and assault towers on top of their ships. On April 12th, they then moved these ships up to the sea walls, seizing a large portion of the walls along the Golden Horn. Intense and bloody fighting broke out all along the sea walls, particularly in the Vlachernae area near the modern-day Ayyubid Mosque complex, where the primary Byzantine palace then sat. The Venetians and the Crusaders set fire to the port area along the Golden Horn, and smoke and fire rushed up the hill as a towering inferno arose. Desperately, the emperor attempted to rally the population of the city, with Niketas Choniates writing, "The emperor went hither and yon through the city's narrow streets, attempting to rally and mobilize the populace who wandered aimlessly about. Neither were they convinced by his exhortations, nor did they yield to his blandishments, but the fiercely shaken aegis filled all with despair." As the Crusaders stormed the palaces and the fire raged over the eastern half of the city, the emperor despaired. It was over. The Byzantine defenses totally collapsed, and with smoke, blood, ash, and fire consuming the ancient city, Emperor Alexios Mourtzouphlos escaped in a small fishing boat. The Crusaders then stormed into the doomed metropolis, and, as night fell, put the capital of the Roman Empire to the sword. The brutality of the Crusader sack of Constantinople has gone down in history as one of the worst crimes of the entire crusading era. Churches, palaces, and monasteries were stripped of their gold and silver. Great and literally invaluable artistic works from antiquity were stolen or destroyed. Some of the best works, including the great statue of the horses of St. Mark, were taken off to Venice, where they still stand. But many, many more were destroyed or lost forever. The gold and bronze that once covered the obelisk in the hippodrome was ripped off, leaving it as the unadorned stone it appears as today. In the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the world, even the holy altar was destroyed. Choniates says, "The table of sacrifice, fashioned from every kind of precious material, and fused by fire into one wholly blended together into a perfection of one multicolored thing of beauty, truly extraordinary, and admired by all nations, was broken into pieces and divided among the despoilers, as was the lot of all the sacred church treasures, countless in number and unsurpassed in beauty. The Crusaders then dragged in prostitutes to dance naked in the great church in a mockery of Orthodox rituals. The Latins rampaged through the city, stealing, murdering, and enslaving. Countless women, including noblewomen and nuns, were raped by soldiers in the streets and even in the churches and monasteries. Fires broke out that consumed at least a third of the city, reducing much of the New Rome to ash. Choniates bewailed that not even the Muslims acted like this when they had captured Christian cities, and bitterly mocked the hypocrisy of the Crusaders, men who claimed to go to war for Christ, but had brutally sacked the greatest city in all of Christendom, writing that these horrors were all committed by men who wore the cross on their shoulder. Anguished and tormented, he bemoaned, "O city, city, eye of all cities, universal boast, supramundane wonder, wet nurse of churches, leader of the faith, guide of orthodoxy, beloved topic of orations, the abode of every good thing. O city, that hast drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury." The sack of Constantinople in 1204 had world-altering consequences. In the immediate term, the Crusaders were able to establish the so-called Latin Empire in the smoking ruins of the Queen of Cities. The Roman political elites would flee to the peripheries of the empire, to Nicaea and Epirus and Pontus, and there they would establish states that would sustain the Roman Empire for the 60-odd years that the Latins would hold Constantinople. In time, they would reconquer their city, and Byzantium would endure in a form. But long-term, the effects were far deeper. The Roman Empire would never regain the prestige, wealth, or power it had held before 1204. Indeed, Constantinople would not rebound in terms of prosperity or population until after the Ottoman conquest of 1453, when it would again come to rule a great empire. For the coming centuries, until its renaissance under the Ottoman sultans, it will be reduced to effectively a town set among the scorched and blood-stained great ruins of its past. The Italian city-states, most importantly Venice and Genoa, would gain a monopoly over the maritime imperial trade routes in the east, enriching Italy, but permanently breaking Byzantium's control over its own economy. In Anatolia, Turkish political power would come to be entrenched, and the Turkification of Anatolia would accelerate and ultimately become irreversible. Now, this will be driven in part by a new mass migration of Turkish tribes fleeing westwards ahead of the Mongol advance, but it will largely be driven by Greeks increasingly converting to Islam and becoming Turks. And this, in part, comes from the shock that Constantinople, the great holy city that was the center of their universe, the navel of the world, had fallen, and the corresponding end of religious administration and political legitimacy that had flowed outwards from the Queen of Cities. And among the Greeks, the hatred, the rage, and the bitterness that this sack of the center of their civilization caused will never really go away. Even to this day, the bitterness felt towards the Westerners lingers. This will ultimately drive many Greeks further into the arms of the Turks, embodied by the Greek saying during the Ottoman period, "Better the Turkish turban than the Latin mitre." The break between the churches of West and East will become permanent, and the Greeks and Latins will see each other as increasingly foreign, just as the rise of the Ottomans will encircle what remains of the Roman Empire. And perhaps most importantly of all, the stage was now set for the next fall of the city. Though it was not inevitable at the time, the conditions that would lead to the final conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had been born. In time, the question will become when, not if, Constantinople will fall to the Turks. And in about 250 years, the Ottoman Turks will finally put paid to the Roman Empire forever, and Constantinople will begin down the road to becoming Istanbul.